I took you yesterday on a tour through many centuries of eudaimonistic ethics, that is to say, the kind of moral system which takes happiness as its basis. And this morning I want to contrast it with other kinds of moral system. A thing that will have struck you when we were talking about Thomas Aquinas was how very intellectual his approach is to the notion of happiness. And this is due to the influence of Aristotle on him, that for Aristotle, happiness consists supremely in the activity of the intellect, not of the will. To be sure, Aristotle doesn't quite distinguish between the intellect and the will in the way that Christians did. But if you translate what Aristotle says into the Christian terminology, it is very much the intellect which is the happiness in this life, and insofar as Aristotle thought there was going to be an afterlife, which is not so sure, again it would be the survival of the intellect. And for St. Thomas, likewise, the ultimate happiness after death in the beatific vision is an intellectual vision. It's not a matter of the heart. Now, this seems in a way rather different from the Bible, where it is the love of God more than the vision of God which seems to be emphasized. And St. Thomas, when he quotes, say, from St. John passages about the love of God, gives them again this Aristotelian intellectual twist. The reaction against St. Thomas, as I mentioned yesterday, was led especially by John Duns Scotus, who taught in Oxford and in Paris around about 1300. And he was opposed to the intellectualism of St. Thomas in several ways. He's often called a voluntarist because of his emphasis on the will, voluntas, rather than on the intellect. And he contrasts with St. Thomas in several ways. One is that he thinks that human freedom is much greater than St. Thomas allowed for. As I said yesterday, St. Thomas thought that the only kind of freedom that human beings enjoyed was a freedom to choose between different routes to happiness. Whereas Scotus says that we have these two inborn tendencies, one to pursue happiness, but one to pursue justice, to obey the laws of God. And we have the freedom to choose between good and evil in this way. Duns Scotus was, I think, the first person to define freedom of will in the broadest possible terms. He said that I am free if at the very moment of doing one thing I retain the power to do the opposite, the so-called liberty of indifference. I can do A, but at that very moment I retain the power to do B. Scotus, therefore, has a very broad view of human freedom, but he also has a broader view than St. Thomas about God's freedom. St. Thomas thought that God could not dispense with the Ten Commandments, say, because God had created humans with a certain nature, and human nature of itself dictated a large number of ethical obligations. And God could not dispense, say, from the command, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not commit adultery. God could not dispense from those without contradicting himself, because he would be undoing the nature that he had himself created. Duns Scotus disagreed with this. He thought that God could dispense with most of the Ten Commandments, or could have given quite different commandments. God couldn't have commanded us not to love him. That was the one restraint on God. He could not have said, thou shalt hate God. But with the parts of the commandment that deal with the relations between human beings, with murder, adultery, lying, and so on, Scotus thought that God was free to dispense from them. Of course, usually he did not. But the treatment, for instance, of the God's command to Abraham to kill his son Isaac are treated differently in the two authors. For Aquinas, it's not really a serious command, but for Scotus it is, and it would have been a good thing for Abraham to obey it. And the final difference between Aquinas and Scotus on these issues is that the happiness of heaven, Duns Scotus thought, was essentially an act of love, not an act of vision. It was the everlasting love of God after death that was the ultimate happiness. So far I have been summarizing what I said yesterday, and I want to go on now and talk about the development of this later after the Reformation. We've had this contrast between Aquinas on the one hand and Scotus on the other. Aquinas is eudaimonist, and Scotus is not. Scotus, let's say, he has double instinct, both the instinct for happiness and the instinct for justice. Now, this contrast between the two was repeated in a way at the end of the 18th century as a difference of opinion between the philosophers Bentham and Kant. Bentham, the English philosopher who was the founder of utilitarianism, and Immanuel Kant, the founder of German idealism. Now, Bentham was also a eudaimonist in the sense that, like Aquinas, he thought that happiness was the key concept from which all moral considerations, moral reasoning must take its start. But the difference was that whereas Aquinas, following Aristotle, was individual eudaimonist, that is, he thought it was the happiness of the individual that was the keystone of the arch of morality. For Bentham, it was not the individual, but the community. It was the greatest happiness of the greatest number that he said was the key to morality. Now, Kant contrasted with Bentham in the same way that Scotus contrasted with Aquinas, because Kant thought that it was duty rather than happiness that was the keynote, the keystone of the arch of morality. There is, though, a difference between Scotus and Kant here, because Scotus placed the appetite for justice on an equal level with the appetite for happiness, whereas Kant regarded duty as the supreme motive which trumped every other, including happiness. Happiness was an inferior goal rather than duty. The principle of utility, this pursuit of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, that was interpreted by Bentham as meaning that the happiness of the majority of the citizens was to be the criterion by which you judge the affairs of a state. And more generally, the real standard of morality and the true goal of legislation was this greatest happiness of the greatest number. So Bentham is like Aquinas in being eudaimonistic, making happiness the key notion of morality. But then there are important differences. First, as I said, for Bentham, what should guide choice is not the individual's own happiness, but the general happiness. And second, and in some ways more important, Bentham equated happiness with pleasure. Now, in Aristotle, followed by Aquinas, there was a big difference between happiness and pleasure. When Aristotle is selecting the best life among the candidate lives, the lowest candidate life is the life of pleasure, thought of as the life of bodily pleasure, and happiness is something intellectual, not bodily. Aristotle, in fact, you could say, didn't think there was any such thing as pleasure, just pleasure. He thought that there were various activities, and each different activity could be enjoyed or not, and the higher the activity, the higher the pleasure in it, so that the highest intellectual activity would bring with it intellectual pleasures. But Bentham, and for Aristotle and Aquinas, it's an important part of the moral education of the individual to get them to take pleasure more in the higher activities than in the lower activities. Now, for Bentham, on the other hand, pleasure was a single, an indefinable feeling. It was just a feeling which could be produced in many different ways, but it was always a certain indefinable, distinguishable feeling. And this feeling was the only thing that was good in itself, and it was the point of doing anything whatever. I quote from Bentham, "In this matter, we want no refinement, no metaphysics. It is not necessary to consult Plato or Aristotle. Pain and pleasure are just what everybody feels to be such." Now, whereas for a thinker like Aristotle, pleasure was to be identified with the activity that you are enjoying, for Benson, the relation between an activity and a pleasure was one of cause and effect, pleasure being the uniform single effect of all pleasurable activities. Moreover, whereas for Aristotle, the value of a pleasure was the same as the value of the activity that was being enjoyed, for Bentham, the value of each and every pleasure was the same, no matter how it was caused. I quote, "Quantity of pleasure being equal," he wrote, "pushpin is as good as poetry." I'm not quite sure what pushpin is. It was some kind of trivial pursuit, trivial game of the 18th century. He obviously chose it to be the most trivial thing he could think of. He wanted to say, it's absolutely as good as poetry. We don't want to have any snobbishness about pleasures. Now, the Bentham's school of thought, utilitarianism, from that day to this has been very influential. It's particularly influential with economists nowadays. But I think you need to take a rather closer look at the kinds of things that Bentham says. The greatest happiness of the greatest number sounds very impressive, but it turns out to be extremely ambiguous. The first question to be raised is, greatest number of what? The happiness of the greatest number of what? Should we add voters, or citizens, or males, or human beings, or sentient beings? The greatest happiness of the greatest number of males, the greatest happiness of the greatest number of humans, the greatest happiness of the greatest number of animals. You can fill it out in various ways, and of course it makes a big difference which answer you give. I think throughout the 2 centuries that have passed since utilitarianism began, most utilitarians would give the answer human beings, the greatest happiness of the greatest number of human beings. And that's most likely the answer that Bentham himself would have given, though he didn't, for tactical reasons, actually include women in the greatest number who were to be made happy. In principle, he thought that I quote, "the claim of the female sex is, if not still better, at least as good as that of the male." But I think he thought that if he went around campaigning for, say, female votes and that kind of thing, he would have lost a lot of support. So he just keeps quiet about this. Now, in recent years, many utilitarians have extended the greatest happiness principle beyond human beings to other animals. Peter Singer and co., those who are saying that animals have rights just as human beings do. Well, Bentham himself was a great lover of animals. He was particularly fond of cats. But he didn't go as far as this. And I think he would certainly have rejected the idea that animals have rights, because he didn't believe in natural rights of any kind. But by making the supreme moral criterion a matter of sensation rather than intellect, he did make it appropriate to consider animals as belonging to the same moral community as ourselves, because animals, the higher animals, clearly feel pain and pleasure, just as we do. And if the ultimate criterion for morality is the amount of pain or pleasure produced, then animals surely should come into consideration. Now, the ancient Greek and Christian moral tradition had placed supreme moral values as being activities not of the senses, but of the reason. And therefore, they regarded animals who lack reason as standing outside the moral community. And Bentham's moral theory, placing pain and pleasure as the supreme moral arbiters, was a break with this tradition, and with hindsight, one can see that in the long term, it was one of his most significant legacies. Now, I am about to go on to Kant. You can see that we are between 12 and 13 at the moment on the handout. Before going on to Kant, does anybody want to say anything about Benson? No, right. Yes, you have, yes.
Since you talked about the relation between pleasure and happiness,
yeah.
I'd like you to discuss about the so-called naturalistic fallacy and its relation to the theories of happiness.
Yeah. Yes, the naturalistic fallacy was I think, an invention of G.E. Moore, was it not, at the beginning of the last century, who thought that it was a mistake to identify goodness with any natural kind of property. And it was never clear, at least to me, exactly what a non-natural property of goodness was like. But his objection to utilitarianism was precisely that he thought it identified goodness with the natural property of something being pleasant. For Moore himself, I think in the end there were only two things that were good. There were certain aesthetic pleasures and human friendship. I think that when I was a young student, almost always we had to write an essay for or against the naturalistic fallacy. I think at least in analytic philosophy, the fashions have changed rather, and few people believe in Moore's non-natural properties, nor do they think that there is necessarily any fallacy in regarding certain natural activities and experiences as actually being good. I will say a little about that under 14 and 15, talking about the modern Thomist's view of, because of course those who followed Moore regarded not only Bentham but also Aquinas as guilty of the naturalistic fallacy. Thank you.
Sorry, not a question, just a consideration, but if you look, there is a real subject, a real argument coming out of the relationship and the way of approaching from human to animal in the last 200 years.
Yeah.
Because it's totally different, the way they approach it in any circumstance, you know? Either for food or for social relations. The approach of the humans to animals has totally changed the communication language.
Yes, I think there has been a further change. I mean, I mentioned the change that was initiated by Bentham but then went on. which was that of attributing rights to animals, and on that basis many people, for instance, became vegetarians because they thought that eating meat was a violation of animal rights. Now, those who retained the more old-fashioned idea that it was rationality that was the foundation, they were not troubled by this. They said only those have rights who have duties, but animals have no duties to us, therefore they have no rights. So we can cheerfully go on eating meat. But I think in recent years, the argument has changed a bit again, because it has been discovered that the raising, say, of beef cattle and eating a lot of beef is an extremely extravagant way of generating the protein we need, and that it may use up the resources of the planet so that future generations of humans will suffer, so that even those who say animals have no rights, now I think have to take seriously the argument for vegetarianism. Not that I am myself a vegetarian, but of course it's not, if you believe in animal rights, then there's a kind of absolute obligation not to eat meat. But if it is the threat that our extravagance poses to future human generations, then it is just the obligation to minimize one's own contribution to this possible future thing. So it is a more complicated argument.
Also because the attitude among plants is also different from human being to vegetables.
Yes, yes, yes.
That is only question mark on mineral, that may be also, but I don't think, I cannot find any change because I have no culture for looking at that. But the attitude of humans also with vegetables and plants and flowers are totally different than it used to be.
Well, certainly of some well-known humans. I mean, the Prince Charles in England is supposed to talk regularly to his plants. I don't know if that is true.
Not in one.
Right, so let us move over towards Kant. Now, in modern times, Kant is at the opposite end of the spectrum from Bentham. The starting point for Kant is that the only thing that is good without qualification is a good will. Talents, character, and fortune can be used to bad ends, for bad purposes. And even happiness, Kant thinks, can be corrupting. And a good will is something absolutely good. It doesn't matter what it achieves, whether it is successful or not in its projects. It is still something that is good in itself alone. And what makes a will a good will is that it is motivated by duty. And to act from duty is to exhibit goodwill in the face of difficulty. Some people may actually enjoy doing good, or they may profit from doing good. But worth of character is shown only when someone does good not from inclination, but solely from duty. A very austere conception. And again, at the opposite end from Aristotle, Aristotle thought you were only really virtuous if you positively enjoyed doing virtuous action. It was the person who never thought of putting his hand in the till who was the really honest person. Whereas for Kant, you are only really virtuous if you don't enjoy it at all. It seems a strange contrast. Now, in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant argues that happiness cannot be the overarching purpose of morality. I quote, "Suppose now that for a being possessed of reason and will, the real purpose of nature were his preservation, his welfare, or, in a word, his happiness. In that case, nature would have hit on a very bad arrangement by choosing reason in the creature to carry out this purpose. For all the actions he has to perform with this end in view, and the whole rule of his behavior, would have been mapped out for him far more accurately by instinct, and the end in question would have been maintained the more surely by instinct than it ever can be by reason." So if what nature wants is for us to be happy, it shouldn't have trusted our fallible reason. It should have just implanted instincts which made us behave rather like animals, I suppose. So Kant's overriding concept is not happiness but duty. And the function of reason in ethics is not to inform the will how best to choose means to some further end. It is to produce a will that is good in itself, and a will is good only if motivated by duty. It's not what achieves, or not what the will achieves, that constitutes the goodness of a good will. The good will is a good in itself alone. I quote again from the Metaphysics of Morals. Even if by some special disfavor of destiny, or by the niggardly endowment of stepmotherly nature, this will is entirely lacking in power to carry out its intentions, if by the utmost effort it still accomplishes nothing, and only goodwill is left, even then it would still shine like a jewel for its own sake, as something which has its full value in itself. Now that passage brings out the huge contrast between Kant and Bentham. For Bentham's utilitarianism, the goodness or badness of an act depends entirely on its consequences, on its foreseen consequences, whether it's going to tend towards the greatest happiness or move away from it. For Kant, consequences don't matter at all. It is simply what the motive is with which you act. And goodwill is the highest good, and it's the condition of all other goods. And goodwill is something which is within our power. We can control our own motives, but happiness is not something that's in our power. Happiness is, according to Kant, an impossible goal to pursue, because no finite being, however insightful and powerful, can say definitely and consistently what he really wants. Riches may bring with them anxiety. Long life may turn out to be nothing but long misery. And only an omniscient being, according to Kant, could determine with certainty what would make him truly happy. For Bentham, happiness is clearly a subjective phenomenon, a warm sensation within each of us. And pleasure and pain are opposites. And it is as natural to take someone's word for it that they feels pleasure as it is to take his word for his being in pain. Whereas for Kant, not even an omniscient being can really know what would make his life happy. Because of the overarching influence of Kant, many moral philosophers in the 19th and 20th centuries lost interest in the topic of happiness, whereas in the classical and medieval times, as we saw, every philosopher worth taking account of produced a massive treatise on happiness. Once Kant said, forget about happiness, duty is what counts. People stopped writing much about happiness, and so you'll be glad to know I'm not going to take you right through the German and British idealists as to what they had to say about happiness. Of course, the utilitarians continued to think of happiness, because utility, as in utilitarianism, was thought of as the kind of modern scientific equivalent of the happiness that was discussed by earlier philosophers. And the first utilitarians thought of happiness as something that it was possible to quantify and measure. Bentham said that what we should do in our actions and projects was to carry out a felicific calculus, that is, to work out how satisfactory the foreseen consequences would be. Now, it makes no sense to talk of a felicific calculus unless happiness is something that can be measured and quantified. And moreover, since utility was the goal of economics, the success or failure of an economic venture or public policy must depend on the quantity of utility produced. Now, throughout the 19th century, many economists believed that the most efficient method of producing utility was the free operation of the market. Now, whether or not that belief is correct, and I suppose the disastrous history of command economics in the last century gives formidable support to the idea that the free market is one of the most efficient methods of producing utility. The point is that this supposes a concept of utility as something measurable, and it supposes that the operation of the market and the production of utility are two separate entities that can be described and measured independently. Otherwise, talk of efficiency would have no meaning. As I say, during most of the 19th and early 20th century, the topic of happiness was left to the economists under the name utility, and did not much interest philosophers. But there was in the middle of the last century, there was, at least in analytic circles, a reaction against it. Sorry?
1950 or
1950? 1950, round about 1950. There was a reaction against this, and happiness again became a concern of philosophers. I start my consideration of this by the paper. We're now in 14. A paper called Modern Moral Philosophy by Elizabeth Anscombe. I think it's reprinted many times, and I think I gave a reference to it in the reading list. Elizabeth Anscombe was a very remarkable philosopher. She was a pupil of Wittgenstein, the great Austrian philosopher who spent most of his life in Cambridge and started a new tradition of analytic philosophy of language in reaction against the empiricism and positivism that had been dominant in the earlier decades of the last century. Anscombe was a Catholic as well as a Wittgensteinian, and therefore knew St. Thomas quite well. She was the translator of Wittgenstein into English and also executor of his will. And she was my own principal teacher, though I was never formally a pupil of hers, but she was a very generous teacher who just kept open house. Any philosophy student, graduate student who wanted to discuss philosophy, you just knocked on the door and went in. And if she was very busy, she had a lot of children, she would send you away. If not, you could sit talking to her till late at night. Now, she wrote in 1958 a paper called Modern Moral Philosophy, and which was a rejection, totally, of both the Benthamite approach to morality and to the Kantian approach to morality. And I quote from that paper: "The concepts of obligation and duty, moral obligation and moral duty, and of what is morally right and wrong, and of the moral sense of ought, should be jettisoned if this is, should be rejected if this is psychologically possible, because they are survivals from an earlier conception of ethics which no longer generally survives and are only harmful without it." It was thought very shocking by a lot of people that she wanted to reject the whole notion of moral obligation. But the reason she gave was this. She says that in Aristotle, for instance, though Aristotle has a lot to say about the virtues and vices and happiness, he has no concept answering to the modern term moral. It was Christianity, she says, which took its moral notions from the Torah, that introduced a law conception of ethics. And under Christianity, conformity to the virtues and avoidance of the vices became a matter of divine law. And I continue quotation from her: "Naturally, it is not possible to have this law conception unless you believe in God as a lawgiver, like Jews, Stoics, and Christians. But if the concept of God as a lawgiver is dominant for many centuries and is then given up, it is a natural result that the concepts of obligation, of being bound or required as by a law, should remain even though they had lost their root." She was writing in the secular climate of Oxford at the time, when probably only a minority believed in a divine lawgiver. If the word ought has become invested in certain contexts with the sense of obligation, it too will remain to be spoken with a special emphasis and a special feeling in those contexts. It's as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts had been abolished and forgotten. It was a cliche of the time that one could not derive an ought from an is. This was one formulation of the naturalistic fallacy. And Anscombe said she agreed with that, but only because she thought that the moral ought was a word of mere mesmeric force, that it was simply a charm utterance rather than anything with a serious meaning, once you've dropped the notion of a divine lawgiver. Now, the most significant practical result of the dropping of the notion of a divine lawgiver is that philosophers had become almost universally consequentialists. That is to say, believing that the moral value of an action depended entirely on its consequences, or at least on its foreseen consequences. So for a consequentialist, the right action is the one with the best possible consequences. But this means that all such philosophies are incompatible with the Hebrew Christian ethic, which held that there are certain things that are forbidden no matter what the consequences, no matter what consequences threaten if you don't do them. So Anscombe proposed in this paper of 1952 that the notions of moral right and wrong should be discarded in favor of notions like justice and injustice, which had a genuine context. And even of these notions, it remained difficult to give a clear account until we had a satisfactory philosophical psychology, by which she meant a satisfactory philosophical account of the terms we use in describing human intellectual and voluntary activity. Because she said one cannot analyze the concepts of justice and virtue unless one has a satisfactory account of such terms as action, intention, pleasure, and wanting. And at that time she said we in England, completely lacked any such account. So she set out a program, having as it were, thrust aside contemporary moral philosophy. She didn't go on herself to write a lot of moral philosophy, but rather to contribute to the area of philosophy of mind, particularly in her book of 1957, Intention, which was taken as a model by many later investigators. Elizabeth Anscombe was an Oxford philosopher from Somerville College in Oxford, and she had another colleague at Somerville who became famous as a moral philosopher, Philippa Foot. While Anscombe was trying to work out a satisfactory philosophy of mind, philosophical psychology, Philippa Foot shared her dissatisfaction with current moral philosophy, but she tried to construct an ethical system based on the Aristotelian analysis of ethicae arete, of moral virtue. And Foot's starting point was that the virtues are characterized, the virtues are characteristics which any human being must need, They have both for his own sake and for that of others. And they differ from other qualities which are necessary for human flourishing, such as health and strength, intelligence and skill, in that they engage the will as well as being capacities. And the virtues concern matters that are difficult for humans and where there are temptations to be resisted. But Foot rejected the Kantian idea that moral worth was to be measured by the difficulty of moral action. She took rather the Aristotelian line that moral worth is really exhibited when virtue becomes second nature, when you enjoy doing good. The really virtuous person is one who does good almost effortlessly. The really charitable person, for instance, is one who finds it easy rather than hard to make the sacrifices that charity calls for. Without the virtues, the life of a human being is stunted in the way that the life of an animal lacking a sense faculty is stunted. And moral virtues are habits of action and avoidance, and they are such as a human being cannot rationally choose to go without, any more than somebody can rationally choose to be blind, paralytic, or stupid. To choose to lack a virtue, according to Foot, would be to choose a maimed life, ill-adapted to the difficult and dangerous world that we live in. And if you opt for virtue, you opt for being the sort of person who needs to act virtuously. We're now at the end of 14. I didn't put Foot's name beside Anscombe, but I should have done. Foot, unlike Anscombe, is an atheist, but both Foot and Anscombe shared a very common approach, a similar approach, namely concentrating on the virtues and their relation to happiness rather than on the Kantian notion of duty or the Benthamite notion of consequences. I'm not going to say any more myself at this point, but we have 7 minutes before we take our break if people want to raise questions. Yes.
The objection against your characterization of Kantian's moral view, simply because I think this theory is a result of a misunderstanding in philosophical historiography, raised by the fact that Kant always makes is a little bit ambiguous in his purposes, but for me it is clear that the charge of formalism that many interpreters and commentators raised against Kant is a charge that misses the point, because if we take also the metaphysics of morals, but overall the metaphysics per Sitten that was published in 1799, so was the last Kant work. You can find that at the first point, humanity is the concrete content of the will. So we are not in front of a pure vacuous and empty object that has to be filled with any content, but we have a concrete content that is the third imperative of the foundation. And for at the second point, this critique that is also shared by Bernard Williams, I suppose, and many other analytical philosophers, fails to me to catch the Kantian's point about emotions. So it is true that duty maybe shines
like a jewel, yes,
at best in difficult situations, but I think also that the metaphysics der Sitten here clarifies a lot of things, because there are many imperfect duties to cultivate love for others and pleasure in practice and do good actions. So the duty is certainly the fundamental motivation, but I don't agree with the
well, thank you. That's a very helpful clarification. I didn't actually myself accuse Kant of formalism, and indeed I didn't explain how the formalism is supposed to work in the universalizability, and I accept that when by universalizability I mean that the motive of duty is acting on a law which can also be a law for everybody else in a similar situation. And as you say, Kant, with considerable skill, works out how we're trying to put yourself in the same position as the others, the emotions will come into play. But even after that, I still think that there is the contrast which I wanted to draw between on the one hand, the eudaimonistic ethics, which places happiness above duty, and also with the consequentialist ethics, which does not allow there to be absolute prohibitions, as for Kant there are, the perfect duties. I will be later, when explaining my own system, try to incorporate something from Kant, which I think is very valuable and very important. You're quite right that Bernard Williams conducted a lifelong attack on the Kantian notion of duty. I will want to defend some of it. Anscombe, I think, Anscombe was very much opposed to the neo-Kantians who wanted to have the same kind of sense of moral obligation as presented by Kant, but without the divine lawgiver. As again I will say later on, in Kant, Kant himself, I think, would not be vulnerable to Anscombe's criticism, because he does make room, as I shall say later, for a divine law. Now, whether Anscombe, I think, would not accept that the activities of the divine lawgiver conceived in Kant's system were the same as those in traditional Christianity, but that is a more difficult question.